Hello, everyone. We are continuing on with our study of Unit 5 in our topic about Elizabeth. We're looking at the various Catholic threats towards Elizabeth's rule. Up until this point, we would have looked at the impact of Mary, Queen of Scots, and her arrival back into England in 1568 as she was running away from some problems that she had caused in Scotland. And we're going to look at how Mary, Queen of Scots' arrival in England in 1568 is going to influence the rebellion of the Northern Earls that takes place the following year in 1569. We're going to start off with our title date and our learning objectives, so Rebellion of the Northern Earls, to look at how the Catholics planned to get rid of Elizabeth, and to explain how Catholics felt about the religious settlement of 1559. So let's go ahead and do our title, LO, and starter. When you are finished with those, you can go ahead and resume playing the video, and we'll take up the starter together. So let's take a look at our starter question to explain how Catholics felt about the religious settlement of 1559. Well, we know that generally Catholics were very unhappy with the religious settlement, and many disagreed for the following reasons. Now, we know that Catholics believe the Pope should be the head of the church. Elizabeth called herself Supreme Governor. She didn't call herself head of the church, but Catholics ultimately knew what it meant. It meant that Elizabeth had total religious control in England, and that's something that Catholics were not too keen on. Now, the Catholics, they were allowed to keep some facets of their faith, so they were allowed to keep candles and vestments, some decorations in the church, but ultimately these were of very minor importance to Catholics. They wanted to keep the Latin Bible, and this was a pillar of Catholicism, and this was removed by the Church of England. Catholics liked to have a Bible in Latin because they believed that if they had a Latin Bible, only a trained priest who could speak Latin could then give a religious sermon and a consistent message would be shared. Catholics had a little bit of a fear if the Bible was in English, because this would mean that anybody could read the Bible and they can make up their own minds about what a particular passage meant to them. And in a time when religion meant absolutely everything to everyone, this was a very dangerous thought for Catholics. Now, lastly, although Elizabeth claimed that this was a religious settlement, it was very evident to Catholics it was a Protestant settlement. And the religious settlement of 1559 was designed to make the new Church of England a more Protestant church with some elements of the Catholic faith. So again, many Protestants, they looked at the new church, they realized that, yeah, we're allowed to keep the candles and the vestments, but ultimately we're losing the Latin Bible and we're losing the Pope as the head of the church. This is not a religious settlement, this is a Protestant settlement. So if there's any points in your starter you might have missed, please do now pause the video, take a moment or two to write those down, and when you're finished, you can resume playing. So as always, it's a good idea to establish some historical context, and we'll always start off with the most important thing, religion. Religion was the most important element in someone's life in the Elizabethan era. Religion explained absolutely everything, why the sun rose and set, why people became ill, why there were good harvests or bad harvests. Spain and France often went to war with England over religion as well. At this time, France and Spain were Catholic countries. Elizabeth was changing England into a Protestant country, and this enraged and angered Spain and France, so they often went to war. Elizabeth was a Protestant queen in a Catholic nation, and we know at the start of her reign, she was not very popular. She wished to separate herself from the ruling styles of Henry, Edward, and Mary. We know they were quite harsh and strict in how they dealt with religious opposition. Elizabeth didn't want to be that way. She wanted to use her via media or middle way approach to try to keep everybody happy. As we've learned in previous lessons, we know when you try to keep everyone happy, oftentimes you just make everybody angry. That's what happened in 1559. She had to reinforce her religious settlement with her royal injunctions. These were the new rules she needed to apply because people were simply ignoring her religious settlement of 1559. So we talked about things like the visitations, where Elizabeth had 125 commissioners go around and check up on the church, sort of like what Ofsted does with schools. We also talked about the active exchange as well, where Elizabeth could assert her power by taking away land and wealth from the church, actually forcing them to rent it back from her, or the 39 Articles, which laid out the groundwork and the core beliefs of the new Church of England. So by applying these royal injunctions, Elizabeth was now giving a very, very strict set of instructions for everyone on how they were to follow her religious settlement. Now, despite these rules, some extreme Catholics still were looking for ways to replace Elizabeth. And this is where that arrival of Mary, Queen of Scots, comes back into the picture. When she returns to England in 1568, this is going to bring up some new ideas of potentially replacing Elizabeth. Some extreme Catholics thought, Mary, she's a Catholic queen, Elizabeth is Protestant, a lot of us in England are Catholic. If we get rid of Elizabeth, we could replace her with Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, this puts Elizabeth in a very, very dangerous situation. Already we have some potential murder plots going on, but Elizabeth does not have any children. Now we know Henry VIII was pretty much obsessed with having a boy, and that was so he would be able to pass on his position as king to his son. But Elizabeth didn't have a child. She knew that if she were to get married, she'd have to find a king of another country. Let's say, for example, the King of France. When the King of France marries the Queen of England, the King of France takes on a new title. He becomes the King of France and England, and Elizabeth loses all of her political power. So Elizabeth didn't want to get married for this reason, but without marriage, that means no kids. And with no kids to take the throne after her death, extremists began to look for new opportunities. And that meant Mary, Queen of Scots, replacing Elizabeth. So what we'll do is we'll take a couple moments. We will write down the highlighted pieces of information for context at a minimum. Anything else you want to include, you're more than welcome to. But please do go ahead and write down the highlighted pieces of information. When you're finished with that, you can resume playing the video. So getting on to the topic of rebellions, rebellions were nothing new. These happened throughout the reign of almost every single monarch in history. When you have someone who is put in charge that you don't vote for, oftentimes you'll have people who disagree with their policies or their rules. And if those people are, for example, rich nobles who have money, power, and military might, they might decide to go ahead and try to overthrow the monarch. Now, the rebellion of the Northern Earls is going to be the very first time that there's a plan in place to replace Elizabeth with Mary, Queen of Scots. And we can actually see, using the graphic on the right, that Henry VIII, he faced three different rebellions. Edward VI, he was only king for a short period of time. He was only king for 6 years, and even he faced two. Mary I, she was queen for 5 years and faced two different rebellions. But it's looking at Elizabeth, we can see the number of rebellions that she faced, as well as three additional murder plots. So sure, she was queen, for 44 years, but that didn't exactly exclude her from facing her fair share of rebellions and oppositions. So what we will do is write down the highlighted points here on this side of the slide. And when you're finished doing that, we can go ahead and resume playing. So a question we often ask is, why was it the Northern Earls who rebelled and not the Earls in the South? So to be able to answer this question, there are 5 questions for us to actually look at ourselves, and they are listed here in red. So we need to try to think about the opinions of Elizabeth in London and outside of London. So what did people who lived in London think of Elizabeth, and what did people in High Wycombe think of Elizabeth? What religions were popular in the south of England and the north of England? Which religions were very popular in Scotland at the time? Who was the monarch in Scotland? And why did Mary, Queen of Scots, head to England? So we'll have a quick think about those questions and we'll apply them to a 16th century map in just a few moments. So let's take a look at a map. You'll notice it doesn't quite look exactly like the UK because this was made in the 1550s. So they actually used ships to sail around the perimeter of the country, and they would chart it like so. So it's not quite to scale as we would see it, but it's exactly what the Elizabethans would have looked at when they were using maps. So the first question for us to look at is, where is London? And looking at this map of the UK, we can actually find London is right here, and we can confirm that. So we actually see the River Thames coming into the country here and up to there. So High Wycombe, we'd be right over here where the laser pointer is, in London, just over here. The second question is, where is Scotland? And Scotland is up here in the north. Now, question 3, which areas used to be Catholic before Elizabeth? Well, it's going to be the majority of the country. Question 4, when Elizabeth became queen, which areas accepted Protestantism first with least resistance? That's going to be people in and around London. They could see Elizabeth, they could go to the castle, they could actually see her out and about when she was traveling. So the Protestant faith is going to spread outward from London in this direction. In question 5, who might try to retain their Catholic faith, especially because they live far away from London and they're near other Catholics? And that's going to be people living in this region. This is where the Northern Earls were most active. Okay, so following on, we're going to make the table we see on the screen in our note. So in the left-hand column, we will have the south of England, and in the right-hand column, we will have the north of England. And we'll need to summarize how each region of the country felt towards the Queen and also the values that they had. So we would know that towards London, most people were Protestant, and they were a bit more willing in that area to accept Elizabeth as the monarch. Even Catholics in the south of England who weren't directly living in and around London, they soon began to accept Elizabeth. They realized her and her religious settlement, they're not going anywhere, they're here to stay. They don't have to abandon their Catholic faith entirely, they just need to go to the new Church of England. Now, during this time, Elizabeth, she was bringing in new ideas into society. And alongside of these new ideas being brought about, Mary, Queen of Scots, also found her way into England in 1568, and she was running away from accusations of being involved in a murder plot the previous year in Scotland. Now, Elizabeth, she valued the Earls in the south of England, and she wanted to keep their loyalty. We learned a term previously called patronage. She wanted to keep their loyalty by giving them land in the north. Now, we can imagine that people in the north who previously owned that land weren't too happy about the southern Earls now taking control. Looking over to the north, most people in the north were very strict and strong Catholics, and they used the old feudal system. Now, you might recall from lessons in year 7 and even in year 8, we talked about William the Conqueror coming to England, becoming the king, and he would give land to his barons who would rent it out to the knights who would then rent it to the peasants. And so land would be rented going down the pyramid, and money and food would be exchanged going back up the pyramid to the king. So the feudal system, although that was popular in the medieval era, was still in full force in the 1550s in the north of England. Catholics in the north, they were a bit more radical in their views than Catholics in the south. And many saw Mary, Queen of Scots, as being the rightful Queen of England because she was Catholic and people living there wanted a Catholic monarch. The Northern Earls were very upset by the interference of Elizabeth, especially because she was all the way in London and she was interfering with their affairs in the north. And although under the authority of Elizabeth, the North was actually largely ruled by two families called the Neville and the Percy family. So they were what we would consider to be earls in that area. They had considerable power, wealth, and they even had military fighting forces of their own. So let's go ahead and make sure we have the following two columns of our table completed. Once you're done with that, you can resume playing the video. So now that we have a firm understanding of what life was like in the north of England and the motivations behind the very strict Catholics who were living there, we can look at their plan on how they were going to get Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne. Now, Charles Neville and Thomas Percy, they were the earls in the north. Their big plan was to attack the city of York with their various armies, get rid of Elizabeth. They said depose her. In other words, it means kill Elizabeth and replace her with Mary, Queen of Scots. And here we can see on the right-hand side, we have Charles Neville on the left and Thomas Percy on the right. Now, after Elizabeth is gone, Mary, Queen of Scots, she's now in England. The big plan was to marry her off to Thomas Percy's brother-in-law. His name was Thomas Howard. Now, Mary, Queen of Scots, she would now be married, she would have a husband, and she would become the Queen of England and restore Catholicism to the nation. So this was the big plan. Very, very few moving parts. All that Neville and Percy have to do is attack York, get rid of Elizabeth, and bring Mary, Queen of Scots, onto the throne. Now, unfortunately for the two earls, the plan didn't exactly go the way that they had initially intended. So Neville and Percy, they rode to the fortress city of Durham with 4,600 men. They went into a cathedral, they destroyed the English Bible, and then they held a Catholic mass. Now, this was very important because holding a Catholic mass was illegal and it wasn't actually held in that particular cathedral for 10 years prior. So after they hold their mass, everybody's really excited about the rebellion. They march south to Bram Moor. Now, the rebels here decided to abandon their attack on York, so the plan is already starting to fall apart, because they heard that the Earl of Sussex and his soldiers were coming for them. They didn't know how many soldiers were being brought by the Earl of Sussex, but they just heard him and his soldiers were on the way, and a lot of the rebels decided, we don't want to fight anymore, we just want to get out of here. There was a lot of fighting between both sides in the month of December. The rebels continued to retreat during this time, so they were constantly being pushed further and further north from the city of York. Now in January, Neville and Percy, they both fled over the border into Scotland, and this was to plan their escape to mainland Europe. They knew at this point the rebellion had failed. If they get captured, they'll be tried for treason and they'll be executed. So they need to make sure they're going to get out of England alive, and that's what they're going to plan while they're in Scotland. So let's go ahead, let's put the highlighted points into our note. When we're finished with those, we can resume playing. And finally, the result of the rebellion. Certainly not what Neville or Percy envisaged when they decided to start this plan. Now, Elizabeth was very strict in the way that she dealt with these rebels, but she also showed compassion in some instances. The first thing we need to know is she had 800 people executed. Most of these individuals were involved in the rebellion in some shape or form, but some of them were absolutely innocent. This sent a clear message to others: do not attempt to overthrow Elizabeth. If you do, you will lose your life. Elizabeth then also took land from wealthy families who knew about the plot but said nothing. She decided not to execute those very wealthy people because she could make a lot of money out of their misery by taking land and wealth from their families. Charles Neville, he actually managed to escape. He made it over to Belgium, but unfortunately for him, he died in poverty not long after. Thomas Percy, he was caught by James Douglas, and he was actually executed. The grip of the Northern Earls was now broken. Now, we talked about Elizabeth showing some compassion, and this is where she did it. Elizabethan law stated that if someone was found guilty of treason, they would be hanged, which was a very common method of execution at the time. But their body must remain there until it rots and falls from the rope. Now, the wives of many of these men who were involved in the rebellion wanted to bury their husbands quickly after they had died so they could get into heaven, if they could actually get into heaven after their actions. Elizabeth decided not to prosecute the women who cut the bodies of their husbands down. So some women went under the cover of night, cut down the bodies of their husbands, and gave them a proper burial to hopefully allow them to get into heaven. Elizabeth could have prosecuted these women, but decided not to. So she certainly showed some compassion towards the families of those who were guilty of being involved in the rebellion. So as always, we'll write down the highlighted pieces of information. And when we're done doing that, we can go ahead and resume playing the video. Now, your final task for the lesson is to complete the worksheet. There are some pictures. You'll need to find the reading about the Northern Earls and complete both sides of the worksheet. Follow the pictures along. It's sort of like a pictorial timeline, if you will. Work individually to complete the task. Use exact dates, names, and details where possible. And anything that you're not able to fill in or you miss, you can go ahead and resume playing the video and the answers will appear very shortly. So we'll pause it now, get started on your worksheet, and in the last 5 minutes or so of your lesson, you can resume playing the video and just check the answers are correct. So you've had a chance to work on your worksheet. Let's go ahead and have a look at the answers. So looking at the key players here, the replacement we would say is Mary Queen of Scots. The Earl of Westmoreland is, of course, Charles Neville. Earls of Northumberland is Thomas Percy, and the Earl of Morton is James Douglas. Looking at the causes, in 1568, Mary comes back to England and Catholicism is given a second wind of support. People say, Mary, Queen of Scots, she'd make a much better queen than Elizabeth. Let's get rid of Elizabeth and put Mary in her place. Elizabeth refuses to get married. Her religious settlement may not last, and the Catholics are quite pleased by this. This is another reason that the nation is starting to lose a little bit of faith in Elizabeth and thinking that perhaps Mary, Queen of Scots, will be the right choice. And this is going to influence Catholic support for her to take control over England. So following along, we're starting on the right-hand side here. We can see that Neville, who was the Earl of Westmoreland, and Thomas Percy, he was the Earl of Northumberland, they hatch a plan. Their big plan is to eliminate Elizabeth, replace her with Mary, who would get married to a man named Thomas Howard, and that was Northumberland's brother-in-law. However, Elizabeth found out, and Thomas Howard begged for forgiveness, and he was sent to jail in the Tower of London. Now, Elizabeth, she's not very happy. She demands that Westmoreland and Northumberland appear before her to face the consequences of their plot. They know this is going to be charged with treason and they'll be executed, so they have a choice. They can either go to Elizabeth and die, or they can start their rebellion, and if they succeed, win. If they fail, they die anyways. So there really wasn't a whole lot of discussion about this. Both Neville and Percy decided, we're already in it. We need to just go ahead and get started with the rebellion. Looking at the events. So November of 1569, 4,600 men march to Durham. They hold a Catholic mass. They tear up the English Bible as a rejection to the religious settlement. But when they hear at Bray Moor that their queen has sent forces towards them, they all decide to run away. So there are three main reasons for failure. We can see them in a mind map in the textbook. The first and foremost is poor planning and leadership. They fled at the first sign of resistance. They didn't have a clear plan on what they would do if they did face any forces from the queen. There was really no enthusiasm to replace Elizabeth with Mary and restore the Pope as the head of the church. So yeah, they wanted to get rid of Elizabeth, but they didn't want the Pope becoming the head of the church again. And Spain was reluctant to get involved. They didn't want to make England angry and choose to support France instead of Spain. Now for the aftermath. Northumberland, he was captured by James Douglas. He was interrogated, and he had his head swiftly removed from his body. Westmoreland, he escapes to Flanders and dies in poverty. And 800 people, mostly commoners, were executed as a warning to others. And as mentioned previously, not every one of them was directly involved in the rebellion. Some had their land taken away as a punishment if they were wealthy. The queen saw this more as an opportunity to make some cash rather than simply executing those individuals. Now, if you have finished off your lesson, you've got your note and your worksheet completed, and you still have about 3 or 4 minutes to go, continue playing the video, and you can watch a short GCSE pod about the rebellion of the Northern Earls, sometimes called the Rising of the North.
In this pod, we'll look at the key elements of the revolt of the Northern Earls, as well as the impact this had upon Queen Elizabeth. This is also known as the Rising of the North.
The revolt of the Earls is considered a key historical event in Queen Elizabeth's reign. It was her first serious threat at home. It began due to the issues surrounding the country's religion. The religious settlement of 1559 had made England a Protestant country, but it did not persecute Catholics. In fact, Elizabeth overlooked the large number of recusants, people who practiced Catholicism in secret, often in their own homes.
However, Mary, Queen of Scots, was still alive. She was an alternative monarch who could rule England and make the country Catholic again. She herself was a devout Catholic. This, combined with the growing irritation of the papacy, set the stage for English Catholics to rebel against Elizabeth.
The Northern Earls gained much under the previous queen, Mary Tudor. As well as land and money, they were given a large amount of power to do whatever they liked in their territories. Elizabeth's government, however, favoured Protestants over Catholics and sought to bring the Northern Earls under their direct control. The Earls were particularly irritated that Elizabeth had not announced a successor, and they had no idea if the future ruler would restore their power or reduce it further. As a result, they began to form a plan of revolt.
It was established that the Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Howard, would marry Mary Queen of Scots. He would help her to overthrow Elizabeth. It's believed that Mary told the Spanish ambassador in 1569 that she would be Queen of England in the next 3 months, and that she would restore Catholicism within England.
The revolt plan was supported by the Earl of Northumberland, Thomas Percy, and the Earl of Westmoreland, Charles Neville. However, the group could not mount a rebellion alone. They were reliant upon Spanish troops joining them on the coast. However, the plot was reported by Robert Dudley to Queen Elizabeth, who arrested and imprisoned but did not kill the Duke of Norfolk.
The rebellion continued regardless. The Earls raised an army of around 4,000 and moved south. They took over Durham Cathedral and celebrated Mass there as a clear sign of their intention to restore Catholicism. Elizabeth had arrested Mary previously and, aware that she was their ultimate goal, moved her to Coventry to prevent her from being freed.
However, the plot ultimately failed. The Spanish support never arrived, and a number of other nobles in Lancashire and Cheshire refused to join the revolt. This was partly due to fear of failure and partly due to loyalty. When the royal army reached the River Tees, the rebels realised they had no hope of winning and fled to Scotland. Northumberland was handed over and beheaded for treason. Elizabeth ordered 700 ordinary people suspected of rebellion to be executed.
So, what was the significance of the failed plot? Well, the rebellion highlighted to Elizabeth the real threat posed by Mary. The Pope, disgusted with Elizabeth's treatment of the rebels, excommunicated her from the Catholic Church. This signaled to other Catholics that now was the time to move against Elizabeth. Elizabeth became more wary of English Catholics than she had ever been previously. She was no longer as lenient as she once was. However, in the aftermath of the revolt, her control over the north strengthened.